The first thing they learned about him was that he didn't scream when the warband stormed the mining outpost. They tore through walls like paper, giving the inhabitants no time to beg. Their bodies crumpled in their suits, breath freezing in their throats as their skin turned to glass. The warband, beings of ice and hunger, didn't care for names. To them, this was just another world in a long chain of victories. Then they found him. The human sat against a metal crate, arms crossed, his breath fogged in the air, but the bitter cold of the raiders' presence didn't affect him. The commander, a towering figure wrapped in frost, narrowed his glowing eyes. "You are warm," he said, confused. The human tilted his head slightly, then stood. He flexed his fingers. "And you talk," he replied, as if that was the more surprising fact. "Interesting." One of the raiders lunged, an ice-bladed arm striking forward. The moment his frozen fingers brushed the man's bare forearm, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. The raider's entire arm shattered, ice splintering into the air, before his whole body collapsed into a pile of frost. Silence filled the room. The human looked down at the crumbling remains, then back up at the warband. He shook his head. "That's a problem, isn't it?" The commander took a cautious step forward, scanning for a trick. The human should be dead, his lungs frozen solid, his blood turned to brittle shards in his veins. Their touch reduced flesh to lifeless crystal. Yet he stood in the middle of it all, unaffected. Another raider, either braver or more foolish, lashed out. A thick, clawed limb struck the human's throat. It shattered instantly. The attacker crumbled into nothing. The human exhaled slowly. "Two down." The commander did not react. He had lived for centuries, fought in hundreds of wars. He had seen weapons that reduced entire planets to cinders. But this was no weapon. This was just a man who killed his warriors simply by existing. The commander's voice was cold and sharp. "What are you?" The human rolled his shoulders. "I was a technician," he said. "Fixed up plasma rigs, kept the drills running. Good, honest work. But some people don't like humans living near their resources." He gestured at the frozen bodies scattered across the floor. "So here we are." The warband stirred. They had conquered world after world, their frozen grip claiming entire species. But something had changed. They could feel it in the air, a shift in balance, a disruption in the cycle. The commander raised a clawed hand, signaling his remaining warriors to stand back. If the human could kill with a touch, brute force wouldn't work. This required caution. "You are an anomaly," he stated. "Our touch ends all life." The human glanced at his own hands, turning them over. "Looks like yours ends with me." A heavy silence settled over the chamber, broken only by the distant hum of the station's failing power systems. Then the human took a step forward. The warband did not move. Another step. The frozen warriors remained still, their breath forming ghostly plumes. The human stopped in front of the commander, tilting his head slightly. "What now?" The commander didn't answer immediately. He had never encountered anything like this before. The way the human moved, the way he stood without fear, it was unnatural. No living thing had ever survived their touch. No living thing had ever defied them. Yet this one did, without even trying. For the first time in his long existence, the commander didn't know what to do. The warband remained motionless, locked in a silent stalemate with the lone human. Somewhere beyond the ruined walls of the mining outpost, the station's automated systems continued their final cycles, oblivious to the strange confrontation unfolding within its corridors. The commander gestured. His second-in-command stepped forward. Unlike the others, this warrior carried no weapons, no jagged spikes of ice. Instead, he radiated a cold so intense that the air warped around him. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to observe. The human met the frozen gaze with something like curiosity. Trying something new? The second-in-command hesitated, then nodded. He reached out, his frozen fingers hovering inches away from the human skin. The air crackled. Tiny shards of ice formed between them, but they didn't spread. The frost hesitated. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he extended his own hand, letting their fingertips nearly touch. The ice warrior tensed. Then, the frost retreated. A ripple moved through the warband, a sound like wind sweeping across a frozen wasteland. Confusion, uncertainty. Their understanding of the universe had fractured in an instant. The commander's grip tightened around the hilt of his great blade. His thoughts raced. If force wouldn't work, and if their very nature had no effect on this human, there were only two paths left: negotiation or annihilation. The human flexed his fingers again. So, what's it gonna be? The commander met his gaze, the weight of centuries pressing against the unknown before him. He exhaled, a cloud of frozen mist escaping his lips. Then, finally, he spoke. "We talk." The commander didn't move, but his warriors tensed. This human had already erased two of them, and no one wanted to be the third. A simple touch had turned their kind to dust. It was unnatural. "You said you were a technician," the commander said slowly. "Not a soldier." "That's right." The human shrugged. "Not much of a fighter. But I don't need to be, do I?" He took another step. The remaining warriors flinched but held their ground. The human studied them, testing their limits. They were used to being feared, to watching entire civilizations crumble before their advance. But this was different. He wasn't afraid, and that uncertainty seeped through them, like cracks forming in a frozen lake. "What do you want?" the commander finally asked. The human exhaled. "That depends. What do you plan to do with me?" The question lingered in the cold air. The warband had never been in this position before. Their touch had ended millions. They had never encountered something they couldn't freeze, something they couldn't claim. To strike him meant death. To flee meant admitting defeat. And if he wasn't the only one, the commander straightened. "You are an anomaly, but if there is one, there may be more." The human nodded. "You're not wrong." A shiver ran through the warband. Not from cold, but from something else. Something unfamiliar. A creeping, uneasy sensation. If humans could resist their touch, then their entire dominion was at risk. A single man had stood against them, untouched by their deathly grasp. If more existed, their reign could come to an end. The commander regarded the human, expression unreadable. "We do not negotiate. We conquer." "Yeah, I got that impression." The human ran a hand over his jaw, thinking. "So what now? You can't touch me. And I'm not exactly planning on going quietly." The warband shifted, uncertain. The human was right. Their usual methods were useless against him. Their advantage was gone. What they were left with was something they had never needed before: doubt. The commander's claws twitched. "If we cannot take you, we will take the station. It is a resource." "Sure." The human gestured around. "You mean this mess? I don't know if you noticed, but your entrance didn't exactly leave the place operational." The commander's gaze flickered over the ruined facility. Their assault had been swift and overwhelming. Entire sections of the outpost lay in ruins, ice creeping through shattered walls and broken corridors. The station was failing. "And what will you do?" the commander asked. "You cannot leave. Neither can you." The human smiled slightly. "Unless you have another ship waiting." The commander said nothing. Their arrival had been brutal. Their ship left in orbit while they descended like a storm. But the ship could not retrieve them without exposing itself. If the human had allies, if more of his kind were immune, then retreating might not be an option either. The human glanced at the dead comms terminal, then back at the warband. "I'm guessing you don't want to talk this out." The warriors remained silent, waiting for their leader's command. The commander could feel their unease growing. The certainty of victory had slipped through their fingers like melting ice. The warband did not hesitate. The warband did not falter, and yet here they stood. The humans stepped back, arms crossed. "So, what's it going to be?" The warband did not answer. They only stared, frozen in place, as something far worse than cold crept into their bones. The commander exhaled, Frost escaping his breath. This was not a battle they could win, not without understanding what made the human different. They had always relied on the cold as their ultimate weapon, but now it was nothing. This lone human was an unknown variable, and an unknown variable could topple entire empires. He made his decision. "You will leave," the commander said finally, "and we will not stop you." The human nodded. Smart choice. But the commander continued. "This is not the end. Your kind is unpredictable. If you are the first, there will be more. And next time, we will be prepared." The human smiled, turning toward the remains of the outpost hangar. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew what was left unspoken. The warband had ruled through fear, but fear only worked on those who could feel it. This was just the beginning. The commander watched as the human disappeared into the wreckage. His warriors did not move, their breath still heavy with uncertainty. He knew what they were thinking. The next time they met, it wouldn't be just one human. It would be many, and the warband would have to find a way to survive. The commander stood in the frigid silence, watching the human vanish into the ruined station. His warriors remained motionless, their breath heavy with uncertainty. The warband had always moved forward unchallenged. But now, for the first time, they hesitated. No one spoke. The cold around them felt different, less certain, less absolute. The weight of their own mortality, once an abstract concept, had become real. If one human was untouchable, how many more existed? The commander turned, addressing his warriors. "We returned to the ship." A murmur rippled through the warband, but none dared protest. Their vessel remained in orbit, waiting for them. The original plan had been to leave no survivors, to reduce the outpost to a frozen relic. Now, their own survival had become the priority. As they made their way back, an unsettling silence accompanied them. Their confidence had been unshaken for centuries. Entire civilizations had fallen without resistance. But now, doubt clung to them like frost. The ship's airlock hissed as they boarded. Inside, the sterile, frozen corridors had always felt like home. But the commander could see it now. The slight stiffness in the warriors' movements, the glances that lingered too long. They had never feared before. Now, they knew what it meant. The warband's control room was lined with dark consoles, icy symbols flickering in soft pulses. The commander approached the central display, eyes scanning the vast expanse of conquered space. There, on the edge of their territory, lay the next target, a distant human colony. He exhaled, the frost forming in the air before him. "We prepare for war." One of the sub-commanders, still shaken, hesitated before speaking. "How, if they cannot be touched?" "Then we find another way." The commander's grip tightened on the console. "We adapt. We evolve. This is not the end. This is the beginning of something far greater." The warband had thought themselves invincible, but evolution did not favor the stagnant. If humans could resist their cold, then the warband would learn to burn. Back on the ruined station, the human strode through the wreckage, boots crunching over frozen debris. He stopped at a flickering console and tapped a few buttons, sending a signal pulsing into deep space. A distress beacon, a message across the void. It would reach its intended audience. Others like him, scattered across the known worlds, waiting for the inevitable moment when the warband realized its mistake. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the blinking light of the console. It had started with one. It would not end with one.